Okay, hello there, APUS history students. I'm going to be talking today about the post-Civil War period in American identity. So I have my coffee. I am ready to go as far as this PowerPoint goes. And actually, this one I'm really excited to talk to you guys about, and there's a reason why I am excited about that. Call it my history nerdy side. But here's why. Up until the Civil War, in many ways, the American identity has been a little bit more simple. And the reason why is that the American identity was shaped around a context of being a farming republic. At the end of the Civil War, that is over, and we never go back to that again. Sure, we have farmers in the country from there on out, but never to the same level. Instead, we have moved now into a much more complicated economy and leadership role in the world. And that really changes our American identity. Or, as we've been talking about in class, it's very possible it's changing our American identities, our American histories. So having talked about that, we are going to take a walk through the post-Civil War period leading up to World War II in order to see how American identity has changed during this time period. So in the late 1800s, what changes the most is the rise of a new economic system. And that new economic system is the system of capitalism. So what is capitalism? Capitalism really, in the end, is a market-based system in which you remove as many controls as possible and have people compete freely in order to innovate, create new types of businesses and new types of systems of organization so that you can mass produce products. If you can mass produce products or services, you can lower prices and be able to sell to more people. In the late 1800s, there are some leaders of this capitalist system who attempt to monopolize the market in order to do what they called providing managerial control. Now, whenever I say monopolization, I can imagine you're probably thinking that this is like a horrible type of thing. Like monopolization carries with it all these negative feelings towards it, that monopolies means taking over. Maybe that's true, but it might not be true too. It really could be about managing systems in order to lower the amount of cost so you can produce much more things. And there are three leaders who do this. First off is vertical integration, done by Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie would buy up all the materials and processes in order to create his product, steel. So think of vertical integration as a line going upwards. Andrew Carnegie buys up the factories, he buys up the resources, the transportation, eventually in order to make steel. Then there's horizontal integration. That's John Rockefeller, where he buys up all of his oil competitors. So think of that as a horizontal line. He's buying up all the competitors in order to lower price and to make sure that he can give the best product possible to his customers. Now, last up, interlocking director. It's probably one of the most powerful ways of managing things. J.P. Morgan did this in the banking system. He would place his managers on various directorates or boards of each banks, and by doing that, he could give out directions to each banking system in order to make sure that they would do the decisions he thought was best in order to lower price. Now, there are problems that are going to come out for this, at least for workers. Workers at the time protested against this and formed unions because they claimed that the wages, working hours, and working conditions were very poor in a lot of the different factories that they had to work in. So they claimed that, they were working about 17 to 19 hours per day. Men earned about $6 per week. Women earned about $3.50 per week, and children, starting at the age of 8, would earn about $1.50 per week when they worked through this. The maximum working hours, they said, look, we've got to cut that back. Initially, they said 12 hours, then they went to an 8-hour workday. Farmers were complaining in the Midwest and claiming that there were unfair freight rates by railroads. So railroads at the time would charge different rates for long hauls versus short hauls. And farmers were noticing that railroads would charge extremely exorbitant prices for short hauls versus long hauls, which didn't make any sense to them. Why would railroads not charge for long hauls much more? Because there's much more of a high distance. Farmers also complained about the lack of currency in the economy. The problem at the time was that people just didn't have enough money or currency in order to spend on the economy. And then last up, middle-class businesses were complaining about people like John Rockefeller. So Rockefeller, remember we talked about buying up, horizontal integration, buying up all his competition? Well, he often did it through what were known as unfair competitive practices. For example, he sent out what were called industrial spies and industrial espionage. He would actually have people from his company go out and get jobs at other companies in which they would spy or create espionage and destroy those companies in order to get an unfair advantage for John Rockefeller. So this led to reform movements in order to try to solve for some of these problems within the economy. One of those reform movements was the Grange movement, which tried to regulate railroads and pricing. This gets to the whole issue between farmers and railroads. The second one was the Populists, who tried to establish what was called bimetallism. They said, for currency, we need to use gold and silver. in the economy. And the idea behind that really was to inflate the currency. Now, you're probably thinking inflation, that sounds like a really bad thing. I'm sure you've heard about that from your parents or you've heard about it in the news. Inflation sounds like a bad thing. Farmers said maybe if it gets too high, but actually inflation can be a really good thing because when there's more currency in the economy, there's more demand, and that means that we can cover the costs that we have. Eventually, in the early 1800s, there was the progressive movement, which tried to break down monopolies through government regulation in order to create more competition. And then last off, workers started arguing for unions, in which they argued that they needed to gather together to have collective bargaining in order to raise wages and better working conditions. And what you see of this already is that we're having conflicts throughout American history. We talked about this last week when we talked about the different forms of history, right? And one of them was the progressive notion of history in which there is class conflict. Well, here we're starting to see that happen. You have one perspective from the owners talking about the need for managing the economy. And then you have the workers and farmers who are arguing that there's a need for reforming the economy, even if it means using government regulation in order to do so. So I want to go back to the progressives for a moment, just because the progressives are a huge movement that takes place in the early 1800s. And they get started by a group of reporters called the muckrakers, who exposed problems with the economic system. So these muckrakers said, look, we're noticing unfair competitive practices or monopolization. And they began criticizing businesses who were integrating markets, people like John Rockefeller. Okay. Another problem was giving consumers proper information. The problem at the time, we're not used to this today because we get this information, this comes out of the progressive age. People would go out and buy products, and oftentimes they weren't given good information about the products. For example, one of the most famous examples we'll study about later on this year was given by a man named Upton Sinclair, who went out to sausage companies and started to see how sausage was actually produced. And he saw how disgusting and unhealthy the situation was, to the point of sausage that had been made and then extra sausage was on the ground and basically rats were climbing over it, and they would just take that extra sausage and make more sausage just to save money. Upton Sinclair put this in a book, and when that book went out to the rest of the public, the argument was made, we need to have accurate information given to consumers. And then last up, conservation, which was the need to conserve natural resources for the future. As capitalism grew, it began using up a lot of the natural resources, and there was a fear that if we didn't conserve our resources, that in many parts of the country, we would end up utilizing too much of it. For example, off of the East Coast, people were overfishing, and it looked like we were going to lose our fish harvest. Or in many parts of the mountains, we would lose out on forest and timber. And the idea was you've got to replant for trees for the future. So that takes us up to World War I. In World War I, the European countries at the time period were competing for colonies in various parts of the world, like Africa, Asia, and the Baltics in the southern part of Europe. This led to a series of alliances and buildup of militaries between the major European countries. And at the time, the U.S. really wanted to stay out. The U.S. was going through a period of what we call in our leadership phase isolationism, in which the United States said, look, we're just going to solve our problems here. Let's keep this to an America first kind of a mentality. But eventually the U.S. gets sucked into this war. And this happens because Germany at the time had come up with a new type of technology called U-boat technology. This is very primitive submarine warfare type of technology. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, tried to stay out of the war, but eventually felt that Germany had gone too far and was threatening the ability to have free trade across the seas. So Woodrow Wilson at the end of the war calls for what's called Wilsonian idealism in his 14 points, in which he calls for leadership, U.S. leadership, to promote free markets around the world and to make sure there's open diplomacy. So what I want you to notice that's happening here and why this is so important with American identity is the moves that America is making. America now has conflicts between classes. America is now moving from an isolated country into a leader around the world. Major changes are taking place in the American identity in the late 1800s leading up to World War II. Which takes us to the Roaring Twenties. So after World War I was all done, America actually reverted back to an isolationist mentality. And part of the reason why it could do that in the 1920s was because we experienced a massive economic boom. This was largely due to new technologies like the refrigerator, radio, car, airplane, and movies. Also, more Americans were making more money at the time. So they were able to move not from farmlands into urban areas, urbanization, but into suburbs. And this was a huge move that took place. And don't get me wrong, 80% of Americans still lived within farming areas. Then you had about 10% of Americans living in urban areas, and then a very small percentage, maybe about 10% living in suburbs. But the amount of people moving into these suburbs and urban areas were still very large. Now, the problem was, by the end of the 1920s, it was very clear that most of what America had kind of built its economy was being financed on risky debt types of situations and speculations on the stock market, meaning they were taking too big of risks on the stock market, and this eventually came to a collapse in 1928. In 1928, the stock market collapsed, and it took about 2 years, but within 2 years, we were thrown into a Great Depression in which there was a severe questioning about whether or not capitalism could work and whether or not even democracy could even work. And that brought us up to the 1930s with a new type of role for the government. It was called the New Deal. And this was introduced by Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt argued that the government had to get involved within the economy to save the economy from itself. That the government needed to get involved in order to provide investments and direct cash to workers to build up consumerism. This expanded government role divided the American public between two different mentalities. You had a certain number of the American public that believed that this went against our American tradition, that the government really needed to be limited or what's called laissez-faire. Another part of the public that agreed with Franklin Roosevelt that the Great Depression proved the government had to get involved within the economy. So think about all the different identities now that are coming out of American politics. The class conflict of the late 1800s, farmers and workers versus owners. Then we have America's role leading from isolationism into a leader around the world. And now we're even having a questioning that's taking place on what should be done with the economy. Should the government be a big government that gets involved in the economy, or should it be a limited government that gets involved? And then we hit World War II. World War II is even going to change our identity even more. Remember, at the beginning of World War II, before America gets involved, so we're talking about 1930s and then really right before we get involved in 1940, the Great Depression really questioned the potential for democracy and capitalism. Two alternatives in the world arose: fascism on the one hand and communism on the other. Okay? Most Europeans at the time period chose fascism, leading up to Hitler's rise and expansion. Why not communism? Communism was seen really by most Europeans as an attack on traditional religious beliefs. And so they weren't going to go in that direction, but they did see fascism as a possible alternative to capitalism and democracy. Now, of course, we know America does eventually get involved in this. Eventually, fascism is defeated, and when it is, America drops the 2 atomic bombs within Japan to end the war. But that changes everything. America goes from, at the beginning of World War II, being questioned as a leader in the world to now one of the major leaders of the world, because we now have not only won the war, but have a monopoly over atomic energy. So what takeaways can we take from this time period? Well, like I said at the beginning, this is such an important time period, I think, in our history, because we've moved from a farming republic into a leader when it comes to economic markets and when it comes to the international position that we hold in society. Freedom and liberty become defined very differently now, and it becomes defined really by your social position in society. Are you an owner who has control over a company and really believes you're managing that company to expand the economy? If you are, you're probably looking at freedom and liberty, meaning as least constraints as possible. But what if you're a worker or if you're a farmer? How are you looking at freedom and liberty then? Well, you're probably looking at freedom and liberty as, how do I get the things I need in order to make sure that I can have economic opportunities? So now you're looking at either organizing reform movements or being a part, or having the government get involved, so that will give you the opportunities within the capitalist system. So who's right? Which one is correct? Is it about the process or is it about the outcome? So government gets defined in multiple ways: laissez-faire or interventionist. And then third up, America is going to change its identity within the world. We go from being an isolationist country that had been utterly destroyed by the Civil War into one that is now viewing itself as a leader in the world, defending global democracy. So are we going to be isolationist? Are we going to put America first? Or are we going to start looking at America as being a moral leader in the world, defending democracy, defending global markets? And what exactly is that going to mean? So that's going to launch us into the next period, which expands on all that, and I think is most relevant to what our identity is today. And we'll talk about that next week. Thanks a lot. Bye.